from Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 to 32. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. And from Secrets of Heaven, section 4274. And a man wrestled with him symbolizes a time when truth is tested. This can be seen from the symbolism of wrestling as a trial. Spiritual trial is nothing less than a struggle or fight because it is an attack on truth by evil spirits and a defense by the angels with us. Our awareness of that struggle is the trial. We cannot undergo times of trial unless we have a goodness based on truth. That is, unless we have a love or desire for truth. If we do not love or desire truth as we know it, we do not care about it. But if we do love it, we are anxious that it not be harmed. The life of our intellect consists solely in what we believe to be true, and the life of our will in what we have convinced ourselves is good. An attack on what we consider true is an attack on the life of our intellect, and an attack on what we are sure is good is an attack on the life of our will. When we are being tested, then, it is our life that is at stake. Good morning, everyone. So that was our little preview. So we're talking about a very short little piece of the story of Jacob. Now, if you're familiar with the story of Jacob, there are many, many chapters covering pieces of the story of Jacob, and we're just looking at this teeny tiny little part. But this part of the story is all about learning to accept that growth is about struggle. Sometimes it doesn't feel like a terribly good news story, but it is, trust me. Now, there are a lot of ways that this can apply to our lives, the ways it can show up. The way I wanted to talk about it today is how it shows up in our relationships, with our close friends, with maybe not so close friends, with family, with partners, with spouses. It's how it spoke to me, so I thought I would share that with you. Before I get completely ahead of myself, though, let's recap where we are in Jacob's story, right? So remember that Jacob is a twin. He's the younger twin of 2 boys born to Isaac and Rebekah. Now, as the younger twin, he's not the, important one, right? He's loved, but he's not favored. When they're born, he's born holding his brother Esau's heel, which is why they name him Jacob, which literally means grasper. And he could, in theory, have just accepted that he was the loved second-born who wouldn't inherit, and he didn't automatically get a bunch of honor and respect by being born first. But no, he's not going to accept that. Instead, he tricks his older brother into giving up the birthright, those honors of being eldest, and he cons their own father. He disguises himself as Esau and gets for himself the blessing that was intended for his older brother. So we could call him a problematic hero, I think, right? He's obviously the character we're following, that we're supposed to empathize with, but at this point, he's a liar and a con man. Not really something we want to be emulating, right? Now you can imagine his brother Esau is not terribly thrilled with this thing that's happened. In fact, we're told he starts plotting, when dad dies, I'm going to kill him. Which, he gets wind of this, and probably intelligently, he leaves. He goes to his uncle in Haran, and he stays for 20 years. I don't know if that'd be enough time to have Esau feel okay anymore, right? And I don't think he knows either. But while he's there, he prospers, right? He works for his uncle, he marries, he has children, he has many, many flocks and herds. 20 years later, God says, hey, it's time to go home. He now has 2 wives, 2 concubines, 11 sons, a daughter nobody seems to mention, and many, many flocks and herds. So he's up for it, he's gonna head home, but he sends messengers ahead to tell them he's coming. And when those messengers come back, they tell him, not only is Esau coming to meet you, maybe that's good news, he's bringing 400 men at arms. Not such good news, right? This does not sound promising. I was thinking of this like if I were trying to get together with a friend that maybe I'd lost touch with. I'm like, hey, you want to get together? If they'd replied with, sure, I'm going to bring my lawyers, right? That would be a whole other thing. That's what this makes me think of. And probably as a response, he's like, okay, let's see what we can do here. So he prepares gifts, these very, very generous gifts, and he sends them off like time release capsules ahead of his family, a herd of goats and a herd of sheep and a bunch of camels and a herd of cows. Maybe this will soften the blow. Maybe Esau will like him better. And that brings us to where we start the story today. So he's camped for the night with the rest of his family and the rest of his possessions, and we're told in the middle of the night, he sends them across the ford of the river so that he's all by himself. And I was thinking maybe this is a thought that he's having of, maybe Esau still hates me, but my family and these people that work for me never did him any harm. So maybe if I go away, Esau can just absorb them and treat them well, right? Who knows if that's really what he's thinking, but he ends up alone on the side of the river, all by himself. Now, we talk in the Swedenborgian tradition about what things represent. And Swedenborg says that the wives and the sons represent truths, forms of truth. And you can think of this like Jacob has sojourned. He's traveled to his uncle and he's gained all these truths. So now he's got his way of living his life. And I think that's like we move through our lives and we develop a worldview, right? We understand the world to work in a certain way because of our life experience, these truths we've learned. So we're going to think of the wives and sons as truths or our worldview. Jacob himself represents us when we are thinking on a natural good level only. So think of this as how we move through the world when what we're thinking of as our top priority is ourselves, right? It's a form of good, but I'm thinking about what's good for me. I'm not thinking about what's good for anybody else. So we've got Jacob, our natural selves, or our ego, and the wives and sons representing the worldview. Now, what happens when our ego is separated from our worldview? Think about this as those times that, hopefully not many of them, but a time when something changes, you get a crisis of conscience, and you suddenly question if your worldview is even correct. Like everything comes into question. The story says Jacob was left alone and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And this symbolizes, as we read, a time when truth is tested. So I'm sure you can think of an example from your own life, but I want to share an example from mine, which, again, this is in the context of a heterosexual marriage, right? But that's not the only way it can be applied. Any marriage, I'm sure, this could easily come up, and any relationship. So this was several years ago now that I realized that my husband Solomon and I have had very different worldviews. I was moving through the world in a, I have to admit it, very Jacob state. I assumed that I needed to meet my own needs, and if somebody else happened to stumble upon what I might need and provide it, that was a bonus, but I was responsible to meet my own needs. If I needed something, I should ask for it. I assumed Solomon moved through the world in the same way, but it turns out he had kind of the opposite point of view, where his thought was that it was his responsibility to think about what other people needed and not really pay much attention to what he wanted or needed. So we had this great marriage where both of us were wondering what Tirah needs, and nobody was wondering what Solomon needs, right? Lovely, lopsided relationship there. So eventually this became obvious to me, and that, of course, was very painful to realize. But it really lines up well with Jacob's self-centered ego vision, right? He takes this birthright and these blessings that were due Esau, and it wasn't that he wished ill for his brother, it's just that he wanted them for himself. He wasn't even thinking about what this would do to Esau. Now, perhaps living his life, getting married, having children, perhaps this started to help him notice, like, that was not cool what I did to my brother. His worldview is already expanding. And the fact that he sends these gifts and now he's willing to go meet up with his brother seems to indicate, yeah, he's maybe figuring this out. For me, being married to Solomon put me in a front row seat for seeing how my self-focused worldview could cause pain, could cause harm. Solomon was often left with the impression that I didn't love him because I wasn't just there trying to meet his needs. I slowly but surely woke up to the fact that we had differing perspectives. This was not fun. There was one evening in particular where it all sort of came tumbling in on me, and I could see all the ways that he could easily feel hurt by my actions. Now, my ego immediately came to my own defense and was like, no, you've been doing it right. He's the one that's wrong. All he needs to do is start coming from your perspective. He needs to own your worldview, and you'll be good to go, right? I can be selfishly focused on me, he can be selfishly focused on him, and we'll be happily two self-centered little people going, I don't think that's actually how marriage works. I don't think that actually leads to a happy relationship. Now, if I just change to his worldview, where we're both just pretending we can read each other's minds and anticipate each other's needs perfectly, it's also going to head for disaster. So the reality is, neither one of our worldviews alone was going to meet our needs. In order to face this wrestling match for me as an individual meant I had to own my behavior as inadequate, as incomplete, and that was very uncomfortable. In the story, Jacob's hip gets injured, right? They're in a stalemate, and then his hip is dislocated, which, ouch. And this, Swedenborg tells us, it's fascinating to me, Swedenborg says that this dislocation is a symbol for a failure to connect to a bigger worldview, right? We have our ego telling us one thing, and our worldview needs to expand, it needs to grow, but this dislocated hip symbolizes a failure to do so. And you can't go anywhere from there, right? If I had just refused to learn from my relationship with Solomon and just stayed selfish, that wouldn't have been a growth place. So we needed to move forward, and yet the story does continue, fortunately. Jacob hangs on and he says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. That feels like those times that we hang in there, I face my demons, I face my selfishness, I don't give myself the ability I don't let myself off the hook. So it seems like it has two endings, one where Jacob doesn't change, he stays in this self-focused view, his hip dislocated, and another ending where he does change, he expands his view. And it's the same way that we have a choice. Now, adopting an expanded worldview is an ongoing challenge. It doesn't just happen once. It's represented by this new name, Israel. He is granted this new name, which literally can be translated as one who struggles, which doesn't sound like a great improvement. I'm going from grasper to a struggler. Oh, goody. Now my identity now gets to be an embodiment of the effort to evolve, to identify with the messy human process of enlightenment. Now, Jacob gets his new name, and then he wants to know who it is he's been wrestling with all this time. He says, please, tell me your name. And this being says, no. But he doesn't even say no by saying no, he just asks the question, why do you want to know? Why do you ask me my name? Swedenborg, interestingly, gives us two completely contradictory messages from this. One passage says these are angels that he's been wrestling with. Another passage says these are evil spirits he's been wrestling with, which completely baffles me. But I believe, what I think it's getting at is that as we're going through something really difficult, it can be really hard to tell, is this something that's a gift in disguise, or is this just a really awful thing that I just have to get through? We can wonder if these things are going to be a blessing or if they're going to be a curse. But we need to choose how we are going to take on these challenges from a true place of freedom. And I think if we knew for sure that this was ultimately going to be a blessing, without any question, that would leave us in a little less freedom to decide where to go and what to do. And the same in reverse. We could easily dismiss something as just a horrible experience. Nothing can be learned from this. We just have to survive it, if we had a solid thought that this is from hell. But we can learn from every life experience, and every single one can be a blessing. In reading this and learning this, it occurred to me that perhaps the parts of my life, even my long history that I look at as only tragic, perhaps I'm just not done the wrestling part. I haven't gotten to the blessing yet. Jacob names this place Peniel, which means a state of temptation, of spiritual struggle. He says, it's because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. He realizes he has had this spiritual encounter and lived. It certainly resonates with me, and the miraculousness of surviving that shame-filled process of realizing the way I'd been treating my husband. In that hardest part of the struggle, right, whether it's this relationship or some other piece, the hardest part, it really doesn't feel like something that you can survive, right? I sit there and go, I've been too unkind. He won't want to ever be married to me still. There's no way my marriage can survive this, right? And yet, it does, by saying humbly, I'm sorry, I was hurting you. I want to do better. We came to a new level of our marriage that was much deeper and more profound. As Jacob's story continues, he is referred to both as Israel and as Jacob, which is this wonderful recognition of the fact that we don't now reach a new level in all elements of our life, and now we're great and we're good to go. No, we will be our grasper self, we'll be there, and then we'll hit our Israel self where we're struggling and recognizing the importance of the struggle. We'll be both as we go on. And it's still true in my marriage. I'm better at being attentive to thinking, what might Solomon need right now? Far from perfect. I'm really grateful that he is doing his part of the work. He's doing his own task, which is he's working on knowing for himself what he needs and asking for it so that I don't have to try and read his mind. And isn't that just the way it is, right? That the best outcomes, the most blessings come when in our relationships we can be intentional about them. We can be in communication and open and honest in that way. Now, we talked about how maybe Jacob was separating himself from his family and he maybe thought he might never see them again, but of course he does. He limps back to them, literally limps back to them, which is so much, it resonates with me in the way that my whole world got turned upside down. I went, oh my goodness, this is the way I thought everybody operated. Turns out they don't. Have I been doing life wrong in every way, in every piece? Coming to a grounded place of going, no, there's some good stuff. I was living my life correctly in lots and lots of ways. Here's a piece that I can do better. So I get to rejoin my family, Jacob rejoining his family, but he is changed. His ego is changed and modified. So this stuff doesn't happen all at once. When we're wrestling with our self-focused Jacob and working on becoming that Israel struggler, we're limping along, doing our best to be kind and compassionate. That's a beautiful, imperfect, human place to be. Amen.